All right. All right. Well, I am here today with the awesome Peter Kindfield. He is the co-founder of Hilltop Education Connections, and and that's in Idlewild, California. And he also is an amazing blog writer. You can find his Substack at peterkindfeldphd.substack. I highly suggest going and reading them. I've been reading a lot of them this week, just trying to figure out who he is and all the work he's been doing. So I'm super excited that he's joining us today and that we'll get to hear directly from him. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Can you give us a little bit of your personal background and just what kind of led you into this work?
Sure, Krista. I want to thank you for the lovely introduction for a start. Um, Boy, I never know where to start with this. So I'm going to go all the way back. I'm sort of from that generation where kids, just played outside all the time. And I have very vivid memories of my childhood. I was a kid who didn't fit in super well in classrooms, but I always felt like I really fit in nature. And so I just have these beautiful memories of after school, being told to go outside and play and doing that. So I always had a deep nature connection. And when I'm going to flash forward a little bit. When I was in graduate school, I was very, very critical of the public school system. I have always been incredibly supportive of teachers who work in the public school system, parents who need to send their kids to the public school system, but the system itself, for me, has always resembled a factory. And so I tend to call public schools factory schools. We segregate kids into age-matched classrooms. We give people work that feels like you've got a job in a factory. And just that the whole system emulates those structures. So I was sort of always anti-factory school, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it was that I did believe in rather than what it was that I didn't believe in.
Right.
And initially most of it was about, like, I have a tagline now. Nurturing educational forests, nurturing educational environments that feel more like playing in a forest than working in a factory. And the first piece of my sort of doing this kind, the kind of education that you and I do, was not outside, but was really working in classrooms and schools, trying to give kids that feeling, more like they had freedom, more like they were part of an ecosystem, and less like they were a cog in a machine. And it was relatively, late, about 20 years ago, I found myself coordinating an alternative school called the Farm School in Summertown, Tennessee. And in my own teaching, I found myself just wanting to get the kids outside as much as possible, no matter what we were doing. And it finally tumbled to me that that the opposite of a factory school really is a forest school, and not just a school that's in the forest, but a school that functions more like forests function. Rather than the sort of top-down authoritarian hierarchy that
And I
teachers
see
are
that
stuck in.
in your writings. Like I love how you always are turning back to that connection between how this is like its own, like the school and the learning process is its own ecosystem, right? And I love how you kind of come back to that. I've enjoyed that in your writings.
Nice. I'm glad. Yeah, so that's the basic story. Is after in that school, I started doing more and more outdoor stuff, and then when I left that school, I was trying to figure out what it is. A friend of mine asked me, "Well, if you're not going to be a school principal, what are you going to be?" And at first, the question terrified me, and then I went, "Well, what do I really like best? Is not being a school principal, it's being a teacher. So what do I like best about my teaching at what was I really enjoying teaching at the school? And it was all about being outside. So when my wife and I moved back to California, we started Hilltop Education, and now what I do is I spend all of my kid time is out in the forest, and it just feels fantastic.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Um,
my journey was a little bit different. I did spend quite a bit of time outside because my grandma was very outdoorsy. She's the one that taught me how to do like the mushroom hunting, and like she comes from a very outside background as well. But I feel like my journey into public school and teaching in public school was more like my return to nature was to find that piece that was missing, right? Because I realized these kids were really missing something, not just academically, but like there was a part of themselves, like a hole that was missing. And unfortunately, during the time that I was in public school, especially here in the area I'm in, it was not met very well at all. Kids were supposed to be having an 90-minute uninterrupted reading block where they're sitting and on task for 90 minutes, which doesn't even work for me as an adult. So trying to be an adult facilitating that with children it was like morally felt wrong, right? Like I felt like I was fighting myself and what I knew was actually best for the kids. And so, yeah, this journey for me was just trying to help find like how can we fix this system to better meet these kids, because I was kind of in the trenches and wasn't really able to do those things. So
Hey, so how did you make the transition from it sounds like we both went through sort of from public
yeah,
school to what we do now. How did the transition happen for you?
my transition was really long, actually. So I kind of got out of education. So I quit public school and I just started a tutoring business for a few years, which honestly was great for me because I think that's where I learned how to be very multidisciplinary, and do a lot more like project-based learning because I had that availability to do so now. So I did that for several years. And then I got hired in at a local college who has an environmental education master's program. And so I got hired in as a teacher with that program. And so we worked with graduate students, but they also had field trips with like school-aged kids, or they also did public programs. So I was learning how to do education at a completely different level. And it was all like outdoor based, which
Nice.
felt really good. I loved it. And having my formal teaching background, I was able to kind of like think about different ways to connect what we would consider formal education in an outdoor setting, right?
Nice.
And I fell in love with it. I loved that. I loved that work. I don't think that place was a good fit for that place, but I wanted to continue that work. So that kind of pushed me into just going ahead and starting my own school because there wasn't really anything like that. I knew that I wasn't going to find that fit unless I just did it myself. So luckily I have a great husband who was like, yeah, do it.
it's super interesting to me, the you mentioned kind of the role that having more freedom played in your intellectual development, and that's been sort of a theme of mine also, that I have been aware, when I was in public school as a teacher, as you meet the standards, there are just so many pressures
Right.
on public school teachers. And then at the alternative school, I was teaching and coordinating it. I clearly had a lot more freedom, but there still were a lot of people who were sort of worried about how much their kids, were they getting the academic, that thing, the academic content. And then when I came here and was doing these nature connection classes, parents' expectation was basically that their kids were with an adult that they trusted and that they were outside. And so anything else I did was, I had no pressure on me. And what I found is the more freedom I had, the better I taught. And the more freedom I gave the kids, the more they learned. But
Yes.
as you started talking about that, I mean, I think this is something that we hold in common, that we played in this system. And for me, there are things that are important to learn. And I want to get to, we're talk about sort of what motivated us to be forest teachers. Um, but for me, there is definitely a lot of content. I'm very interested in kids learning. But by not having the pressure to get them to learn that, I discovered, lo and behold, they learn better and better the less
Right.
I worried about whether they're getting it.
Right. Well, and I think that, I mean, whenever you can get kids moving, right? Because that was something that I always took away from college is we talked about play-based learning, we talked about multisensory learning, we talked about scaffolding. We had all the right vocabulary, right? And they told you you should do it, but you can't actually do it. You can't actually do it in the public school setting. But when you have the freedom of like a forest-based or nature-based program, that brings a whole new level to multisensory learning, right? And yeah, I went from having a classroom where maybe a third of my students were at grade level, and like I was told by administrators to like if like to have my high kids teach my low kids, and like my super low kids, don't even worry about them because they're not going to pass I-step. Just focus on that one group because we just, they're the ones that will pass and we need them to pass high. And I always struggled with that. And since I have started this program, I'm not selecting for, academic achievement. Most of my kids that are coming in have not done well in traditional schools, and they're all above grade level. And it's not like we're not doing 90 minutes of reading every day. We're not doing a 60-minute math block. We're literally just learning through multisensory ways, through play-based education. And because they have buy-in, they have autonomy over their learning. You work less, to be honest. You're working
Yes.
less, but you're getting more quality learning out of it. So that was my turning. That was like that sold me right away.
And I think like the working less, we shouldn't undersell that. Um, for me, we're not doing it right unless the kids are relaxed and we're relaxed and we
Mm-hmm.
all feel kind of slowed down in time. I mean, it's one of the benefits about being in the forest, right? And
Right.
I feel the same way. I feel almost guilty. Like my job is fun. I get rejuvenated by doing my job.
Right.
I tend to have, when I'm not teaching, I tend to be a little sadder than I am because it's fun learning in a playful way with others out in the forest. And that's what we get to do now. And
Well,
so
when
it's
we
no
allow
wonder.
kids, like I'm sure you've seen this, like when you allow the kids to have autonomy over their learning, they can see things on a level that I think as adults, because of some of our experiences and things like that, we kind of can have a very narrow mindset when it comes to certain things that children have not been conditioned into yet. And so I love seeing that. For me, that is, I mean, like that's intrinsically motivating for me as an educator.
Sure.
Um, that you don't get to have those moments as much in public school.
Yeah.
Um, so it is a very, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are obviously areas that we still work harder. Like with the safety things and the the just the general running of a program takes so much work, as you
Sure.
know. But it feels so much more rewarding because I don't feel like I'm selling my soul to get these kids where they
Yeah.
need to be. We can have fun, we can be ourselves, and it can be like we can teach these kids, which I think is another part of education, right? Education transcends just the formal education side of it. We are helping develop these kids into a growth mindset, a love of learning, all these different things. If we can teach them now to enjoy being in the moment, to take this moment and see what you can learn from it instead of just hurry, 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 get to the next thing. I think that we're creating a generation that's going to have a greater appreciation for learning, but learning in a way that's more critical and has more problem solving um, tendencies to it versus just I memorized this like 5 years ago, and it, popped into my head just now.
Exactly. So maybe we ought to talk a little bit about, because a thing that we both have in common that we sort of have mentioned here that I don't think is necessarily common in all nature programs or nature schools is that we have, we have an agenda, or at least I'll say I certainly have an agenda that
Yeah.
and maybe if I can spend a second, like why you mentioned one of the reasons why I have an agenda, which is to help kids be thinkers, rather than absorbers.
Hmm.
In addition to that, I don't know how you feel about the state of the planet at the moment, but my general feeling is, you know, ecosystems work because beings in ecosystems don't do a lot of harm to their environment. Um, from my point of view, this ends up with a very kind of spiritually system, but it's not, sort of hippy dippy, like, oh, ecosystem, minimal harm is practiced in ecosystems. Isn't that sweet? It's, because the universe is a lovely place. It's because if you mess with your environment, you die.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's why ecosystems work by minimum harm, and mutualism is so common because mutualism keeps environments functioning and it keeps beings alive.
Hmm.
Uh, so uh, human beings have, and I won't go into sort of my whole explanation of how this happened, but we're original humans, our ancestors and all land-based people functioned as participants in ecosystems.
Hmm.
The dominant culture doesn't work that way.
No, it
And,
it doesn't.
and the planet, in my opinion, is a horrible mess right now. So I'm super, super motivated to help kids both learn to live in a way that, had we all been living this way for the last 1,000 years, the planet wouldn't be in such a mess. And also teach them skills, because I don't know what things are going to look like when the kids I work with in 20, what things are going to look like in 20 years. And I suspect very, very differently right now. And I expect a lot of issues with supply chain and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of have my own pressure to, these kids need to learn sort of a different way of being, and they need to learn survival skills, and they need to learn how to think in ways, as you were saying, sort of
Mhm.
outside the box, because it's going to be a different world that they're in, and none of us know what it's
Yeah.
going to look like.
I completely agree with you. So that's why my school is not just a nature base. We also have the farm component. So we believe in like sustainable farming, and those are things that we teach the kids. And the kids the kids help me collect eggs every day. They help me feed the animals. They help me start the seeds for the garden, save seeds for the garden, because I think these are really important, one, life skills to have. But two, I think that if we can teach kids how to live alongside nature instead of always trying to feel like we need to dominate it or control it, but learn how to live seasonally, how to use what is available during that season. I think that it's not only a more sustainable model, but I think that it does something to us as human beings when we are aligned with
Yeah.
nature. And I think that's the best way to really go about combating some of these issues that we're seeing on a global level. So that's
As
a
you
huge
can tell,
deal
I
for
can't
me.
agree with you more. Also, teach gardening and relational gardening and all of that.
Yeah.
And I do think it transforms us. I mean, I've been having trouble figuring out sort of metaphors to talk about this with people, but the the closest I can come is that if you the number of people who could not make it 24 hours in my woods, which are, I'm in California. It's no longer wild woods. There's very few bears, lots of coyotes and mountain
Yeah.
lions. Anyway, it's really easy to make it 24 hours in my woods. And so many members of modern society would just be in a panic state. And for me, it's like spending your whole life on an ocean liner and not knowing how to swim. That, sure, everything's taken care of and you're okay, but you have to hang this anxiety that if anything happens, you're out of luck. You're dependent on all of that infrastructure to survive.
Well, I think that was by design, right? Because if you're dependent on certain systems, that definitely feeds into consumerism, right? And I have this, opinion, we'll just say it's an opinion, that if we can break that tie with consumerism, to be honest, we're going to be more fulfilled human beings, right?
Absolutely.
So if we can instill that, and it's hard as an adult, right? Because I did not grow up this way. I grew up in the suburbs. Like we ate out more than we had. We definitely didn't grow any of our own food. I was very disconnected with the food chain in general. So much so that in college I became vegan, thinking that that was the answer to everything. Just to come to find out that like now, we're hunters. We also raise our own meat. And like thinking about the ethics between even just like mass plant processing for, the vegan lifestyle. And I mean, there's so many different interconnections, right? And being able to pass that down to kids and being like, okay, like the chickens, will go through and clean up, the cattle's fertilizer, and like there's these systems that are in place, and like these systems, when they're balanced, they're very good all the way around. They're good for us, they're good for the animals, they're good for the planet. But I didn't have that until I started doing this on my own, because like we're not taught these things in school. We're actually taught quite the opposite, right? We're taught to be dependent on the system. The best thing you can do is, like, I don't know if you saw the article that's been going around that Yahoo News put out, but it was talking about how independent small organic farms is actually putting out more carbon than mass producing farms, or and it was just really interesting to see that the pushes that they're making, but how far-fetched they are. But if you're not in that system, if you're not familiar with these systems, it would maybe make sense to you because you're not in it. You're so disconnected from it, right?
It's funny. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time here because I think it might be useful for folks who are listening to, for us to talk a little bit about how we do what we do. But I am I no longer call myself a vegan, although I still eat mostly a vegan lifestyle. My animals that I eat I love to eat the aphids off of my plants because I don't like them on my plants. They've taken the nutrients from the plants, and they're actually fairly tasty. But what's funny is I'm one of those vegans who, I have lots of friends who hunt and do regenerative agriculture with animals on their land. And, I think that is fine and dandy. The thing that I am, sort of surprised by it's what you were just talking about, how disconnected people are from their food systems. Right. And I've even, I get into arguments sometimes with my kid brother, because my opinion is basically, if you're going to eat meat, you should kill what you're going to eat. And I know a lot of friends who do that, and I have the utmost respect,
right,
for folks who do. Anyway.
Well, there's so much more, like, I don't know, I know for my family in general, my garden has more square footage than our house, which isn't saying a whole lot because we have a small house. But yeah, we have a huge garden, and like I said, we hunt and we raise our own food completely. And so I found
that's amazing.
It's a lot of work, but I love it, and it works very well with my school model. But what I found is between us canning and just the energy and effort that we have to put into raising this food, the amount of waste, like before we did this, our compost was always like so full, and we always had all this compost, which was great for starting plants.
Sure.
Right? But now that we are raising our own food and I'm having to put all this energy not into just growing it, but also like canning it and preserving it and all this different stuff, like we waste so little that like our dogs are so sad because they don't get any scraps anymore because like there's less waste because we understand the amount of energy that goes into that product, right? And we have a lot more respect, I think, for our food than we ever had in the past because of that.
So here's a question, I guess, is it's very interesting to me because somehow, obviously being very different people, we've ended up in very similar places in a lot of ways. When I hear you talk, everything you say fits together for me. I am surprised at the amount of forest education doesn't always mean what we're talking about.
Right, yeah.
I mean, and again, I'm very sympathetic to anyone who's spending more time outside, however they're doing it. But I'll see posts where, I'm a huge fan of, I'm sure nature, what I call transformative nature treasure hunts. And
Yes.
for me, that involves the kind of stuff we're talking about. It involves developing an intimate relationship with nature so that you learn how you can do a give and take. And instead of being, as you said, alongside nature, you can really be in it. So for me, treasure hunts are like looking for sap that you can use for glue, and looking for things that you can eat, and looking for wood that you can make a bow drill from, and all of those kind of things. And I get really sad when I see people posting about, oh yeah, we did a treasure hunt, we bought all this plastic stuff and we buried it around, and have the kids look for these little plastic trinkets. And I'm like, wait, you're doing a forest school. Don't you have this whole vision of no waste and non-consumerism and really learning how to be in the land? And again, I sympathize and empathize, and I don't want to be critical of those folks, but I want to think about sort of how can we help them get a bigger picture.
Right. Well, that's kind of my goal through this work, interviewing people like you and some other people that I have lined up, because I think that I know for me, coming from public education, you're pretty much on learning everything that you've been told, right? And if you don't have a personal connection with nature, I feel like it can be very overwhelming and even scary to think about allowing kids into a space that you feel scared in, right? So I think showing adults that are interested in this type of work that you don't need a play set, you don't need, because I don't allow, we don't have any kind of things like that. Everything we have is you play with it, it's in nature. We're not bringing outside things from home. We're not making or bringing in man-made things. And I think that's really important because, one, like you said, we definitely don't need to be adding any more plastic out into the wild. But I think it's also important to teach kids that nature provides, right? We don't have to. Again, it goes back to, I feel like it goes back to that consumerism mindset that happiness equals getting things, tangible items.
Yes.
So, but that can be a hard thing to learn, and I think that it starts with baby steps. I know when I first started, my rules were a lot tighter than they are now. And I also feel like my activities were a lot more structured, whereas now I've found a better balance. But I think that it just takes listening or meeting the right people to be like, okay, they're doing this is safe, being able to feel like you can be responsible in nature, even though you have maybe limited experience, and build on that is an okay thing, and not going in having to be a master of your craft, I think is what probably holds a lot of professionals back from doing this.
So there's two things I'd love to talk about. One really briefly, and then one, I think we maybe spend, some more of our time on. The brief one is that you and I clearly both have that it's not that this consumerism and ecology being at odds is not a coincidence.
Mm-mm.
For me, consumerism and capitalism survive based on a view that nature is bad and we have to protect ourselves from nature. Almost all of the products that we buy are to protect ourselves either from outside nature, or the thing that I'm most angry about as an older person, protecting ourselves from our inner nature. Like I go into, when I look at, I've spent a lot of time getting to the point where I can look at myself, and instead of seeing, you're old, you're not supposed to be old, you should have, more hair, and, you should have, whatever, you should go out and buy a ton of products so that you don't look like you're aging.
Right.
I think that, this anti-ecological view is what the whole system depends on. We wouldn't be buying all these products if people like you're wrecking capitalism, my friend.
Right.
You're a revolutionary. You're not going out buying all kinds of products. You're growing your own food and hunting your own food, and you're going to break the system if you keep doing that. And thank God, please keep doing that.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's so funny because so I have a lot of family that's from the South, and like that, this is just the way they grew up, right? Like my grandma, like right now, my husband is literally rendering lard from a pig that we butchered to save, and like that's how a lot of our Saturdays go. But it's so revolutionary, and like people think we're weird or that we're crunchy, or there's all these stereotypes, which is hilarious to me, because I mean, like, we're talking not even 100 years ago, this was commonplace.
That's what people
right?
did.
And so for me to think about like the amount of time humans have spent on this earth, and how just within this last 100 years, there has been this huge shift into taking away our connection with nature, or our ability to be sustainable with what's provided in our areas and things like that. I'm amazed at how quickly that has turned. I'm thankful in the fact that, like, so with the farm that we have, I'm seeing a lot more people my age really looking for that lifestyle, right? Because there's something missing. I think there's a lot of, I think as a millennial, I can speak for a lot of us, that it just feels like there's something missing that we're searching for. And I see a lot of people kind of looking into that type of lifestyle. And I can say that myself and other people I know that have done it is so fulfilling, because you get rid of this need to assimilate, I guess. And it is really freeing. And I think that once you do that, I think honestly, it's made me, I've always kind of liked to think of myself as a scholar or an academic. I love learning and developing and having a growth mindset. But I think this has been deeper for me, because I'm now taking things that, those connections, those worldviews, and able to grow in them because I'm living this, right?
Yeah, I think it for me, that's a huge piece of why I want people to learn how to take care of themselves in nature, in our home, is because it is, it really is transformative. It's one thing to have that as a philosophical idea and it's a very different thing to live it, as you say. And
Mhm.
I'm, way behind you in terms of living ecologically, but each of the steps I've taken has been so powerful. We have a gray water system, and our gray water system feeds out into our garden.
Yeah.
And I don't want to eat paint thinner or, organic solvents or whatever else.
Right.
Any move that we make in this direction makes we are all one. We're all part of the same system, just that more obvious.
Mhm.
I would really love to do a slight switch in emphasis, because I probably have about 15 minutes of sitting left in me before I get outside, and you probably have a ton of things. You need to go help your husband render some of that pig lard,
Yeah.
which is, I think, a great sad activity personally. So you mentioned balance, and I think, again, a lot of people who are interested in the kind of work we're doing, it's kind of a supplement to
Yeah.
school. It's like we're getting outside after school, or we do forest school once a week or whatever. And so I'd love to share for a minute just kind of a little bit about how I, really like what I do to get that balance. And then I'd love to hear, the same from you.
Yeah, I love that. Let's do it.
So for me, I still do lesson plans. I also, anyway, I still do lesson plans, and I still think a lot about what it is that the kids are going to be doing and what it is that they're going to get out of it.
Mhm.
However, my lesson plans are incredibly different than the lesson plans that I used to teach people how to do when I was an education professor.
Yeah.
My lesson plans now have things on it to remind me of what the big ideas I care about are. It's all about relationship. We're all interdependent, and in more detail than that, those big ideas generally sit on and I print them out on paper. I hate to do it, and I stuff them in my pocket, and I have them with me when I'm outside. Generally, for my 10-week sessions, the big ideas don't change. It's the same, and they mostly evolve a little bit as I go from session to session, as I get them more solid. And they're basically all about kinds of science-y stuff that I want the kids to understand, because I want them to know that a lot of what they think about, like the nature being all competitive, is a bunch of hooey, and that in fact, so for example, like if I have we're all interdependent, and one of my activities may be pay attention to the rubber rabbit brush and the 6 species of bees. It's not 6. 3 species of bees that all feed off of the rubber rabbit brush at the same time.
Mhm.
And they're just all there fulfilling their needs, avoiding messing with each other. So anyway, I really want them to get these big ideas. So I have my big ideas on the piece of paper. I have some activities written down that are things that I think they might love doing. If we were building shelters last week and they seemed really into it, it would be building shelters. If it was going to snow, it would end up, my suggested activities would be sleigh riding and building snowmen. And then it's kind of my job to have those ideas in my head and then to go out into the woods and kind of see what happens. I left out a step because I always share my lesson plan with the kids at the beginning of class. I say, these are the things I was thinking about doing today. These are the things I'd love to talk about. What do you guys want to do? And what do you guys want to talk about?
Mhm.
And there are days where I come back and I journal and I go, oh my God, it sort of looks like we followed the lesson plan.
Yeah.
Like we did all the things I thought we were going to do. And we talked about all the stuff that I thought we were going to talk about. How bizarre. But even on those days, it was a wander through the forest. It was not a march through a factory. And yeah,
Right.
we did those things, but not in that order. And it was in response to what kids bumped into, um, and all of that stuff. And so I'm really curious to hear. You also have this public school experience. I'm sure you used to do lesson plans all the
Oh yeah.
time. I'm curious to know if you do them now, how you use them, how I'm really interested to see
Yeah.
how similarly our systems have evolved
So
coming.
it sounds like they're pretty similar. So I was a curriculum developer too, which I hate mass curriculum. I don't think it works ever. So even though I was on a curriculum board, I always wrote my own curriculum anyway when I was in the school, and I only passed out the papers I had to make it look like we were using the curriculum so I could avoid being in trouble. So with that in mind, I think that was helpful for me because with my program, so we are homeschool co-op is how my program is structured. So I do still try to hit all of the Indiana academic standards, but we do it in a way that is based on play-based or nature-based or both, which is actually fairly easy now that I've been doing it. My first year, it felt like almost completely overwhelming, but now I feel like it's almost very natural. I do things differently than I did in public school. So I think with a forest school, the main thing is like making sure that certain concepts are being taught seasonally, right? So for like the rock cycle, it may be a little harder to do that.
Can I stop you, Krista? The
Yeah,
extent to which we're on the same page, just as
right.
mine. My next Sunday post is going to be Rock Cycle.
That's awesome.
It's the working title is Rocks in the Washing Machine, exploring
Oh, I
rocks.
love that. I love it. But I mean,
Anyway, I'm sorry to break your flow, but
I feel like you have to have like a big picture, right? And like you said, having flexibility is huge because I don't want to take away from those aha moments. And I feel like if you are attuned to where your kids are and what your mission is, even within flexibility, you can usually bring it back around to like whatever your mission was for that lesson plan. So I still write lesson plans as well. And I even go so far where I send a digital newsletter to my folks, so
me
they
too.
all know what we're going to be looking at and focusing on and things like that, which I think is really good because I think a lot of the parents usually find that they have some connection to one of the specific nature or science-based themes we're doing and they want to build on it. And I think that's really good for their families. So I try to take a more seasonal approach. So like, August, September, October, it's a lot of gardening, ecosystem work, talking about plant development and things like that. In October, we're doing a lot of like seed saving or even talking about foraging. So like I try to think of it seasonally and then I just scaffold everything else to what's going on in that season. So it's not that like math and reading become an afterthought, which in the public school setting, I guess that they would probably feel that way. But I actually find that it strengthens those things if we're connecting it to whatever's going on seasonally, because that's what the kids are going to be interested in anyway. So if the books that we're reading, the writing that we're doing, if I'm incorporating math into whatever activity we're doing, it's like I said, it's going to be a better learning environment. It's going to be retained way faster than what if we were just doing worksheets or trying to do it as an isolated subject, right? So, yeah, it sounds like we're doing a lot of the same work.
Yeah,
And
it's
that's very
interesting.
different around here because, like, what you were saying is I'm the only one in my area that does like a formal education component to my forest school. A lot of the forest schools around here are very much just inquiry into nature, pretty much, which is fine. I think that there's definitely a huge place for that, especially in like early childhood and even just like family connections. But I think it's a little bit harder if you're, I mean, it does, it takes practice trying to like figure out how to, scaffold and integrate different subject areas because we are a society that is like math and reading and science and history. They're
Oh,
not
because it's
all
all about separation.
interdisciplinary, right? So,
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean two things. I Um, and then I'm going to leave formal alone. I don't, I mean, I never thought of myself as doing seasonal planning, but what I do think about all the time is that there's really three things. I'm sort of, as an aside, I'm trained as a mediator, and there's something appealing to me about the word mediation. And the words I use to describe what I do, there's, two that I like a lot. One is guide, and the other is mediator. And my mediation isn't so much between the kids, although that happens occasionally. They generally get along pretty well. It's these three things. Our curriculum focus, which for me, I'm in a situation where, like, I participated in developing science standards, and I just have such an allergy to the standards movement. So as I said, I kind of have my own set of things that I think are absolutely critical for kids to learn, which include things like the rock cycle and the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. And if I ever looked at them again, which I really don't want to, they probably fit the, NGS standards, and they probably, the content that I do focus on probably gets to their stuff. But I sort of organize it in a way that pleases me, that focuses on these big ideas of interdependence and things like that.
Well, and I find like for me, I did it because I feel like there's a need around here where parents are still really wanting to make sure that those standards are being met.
Yes.
But to be honest, they're just a baseline because it's so easy to hit those. And what I actually just finished. So I do send home bi-monthly progress reports. They're not, I wouldn't call them grade books, but just kind of to show where we're at on everything, just so I can monitor growth. All of my kids are above grade level, whatever that means, right? Like, I feel like it's such an arbitrary system. Whereas, like, we're saying, okay, well, you're 8 years old, so this is what you should know.
Yeah.
Right? And so I use them as a baseline, but I find that if you're really doing quality learning, I mean, one, it's super easy and natural to just hit them anyway. And two, we're going to go way above and beyond what those, standards are going to be set anyway.
No, I totally understand your use of them. I just personally, as someone who's
I love that.
Old and for 40 years have had to justify everything I did in terms of, and now I don't, because I'm an after-school program, and all of the stuff that the kids learn is sort of gravy to the teachers. But the big point I wanted to make is that there are these three things. There's what I would love the kids to learn. There's what's happening with them. And then there's what's happening outside.
Right.
And so, for me, I do end up being like, I never had thought about it, but I do teach seasonally, because when it's spring, we're planting, when it's fall, we're seed collecting and harvesting. And, when it's snowing, we're dealing with, the science that we deal with is the molecular kinetic theory of heat, because the kids are asking, why do my hands get so cold when they're wet, and all of that stuff, and it's just all so right and there.
And they're gonna retain that so much with having cold hands versus reading that in a textbook, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm writing about in the rock cycle thing is about sort of teaching approach, and that for me, the talking that I do, I want to do it as much as possible in response to, a project that they're, as you mentioned, a project that they're engaged in, or an experience they're having, or their own interests or their own questions. And as you say, that's where, I like to point out to parents, like, two things. One is, where'd you learn how to walk and talk? Probably wasn't sitting in a classroom listening to lectures.
Right.
And where did you learn everything you know about doing your job? And, I had a friggin' PhD in science education. And when I was teaching science, very little of my formal background had anything to do with, my learning
Mhm.
was, in the context of trying to accomplish stuff.
Right.
So I think you're absolutely right that the kids learn way, way better, and with it's way less effort once we get our role. The,
Right.
at the very beginning of this talk, you mentioned one thing that is the thing that I tell people that's hard about my job is, I say being out in the woods with kids, is a wonderful thing. And they have knives and saws and the woods have, coyotes and poison oak and blah blah blah
Right.
blah blah. So I do, it's not, I'm never 100% relaxed. It's kind of
Right.
like being a lifeguard in the forest.
Right.
So it has its tensions,
Yeah.
but gosh, nothing like that feeling of being in a public school and meeting all of those demands and having all of that.
Right. Well, and I
All
think
of that.
that I'm just so excited. I think that I think this year has really showed me that I, I think other people are starting to see the need too, right? Not just
Oh yeah.
educators who have been in the system, but like families. I will say, like, if anything good came of COVID, I would say that is it. Like people are like, okay, this is not working anymore. Like we need or want more. And so I'm really thankful for that, and I hope this continues. I do because I have a heart for public schools, and that I was always in low income schools. So
Yeah.
there are several families that can't afford to do programs like ours, and
Yeah.
even if so I'm not a nonprofit, but even with nonprofits, you still have to have scholarship funds and things like that that are limited. And I'm hoping that as this grows, it can become more accessible to all families. And
Yeah, Krista, you mentioned my blog at the beginning, and I don't know that it's helping in this way, but I'm plagued by the implied question behind what you just said is how, or how do we reach non-privileged kids? How do
right,
we get to the kids who probably need this more than anybody else?
exactly.
And not only in this country but elsewhere. And so, what I think is probably a feeble attempt, but my blogs are free, and I'm hoping that somehow they're of some use to people out there who wouldn't, families who don't have access to programs
Yeah.
like this. But I don't think it's a big move in that direction. And maybe, if we end up talking again on video or not, I'd love to talk with you more about, I have that same pull towards,
Yeah.
marginalized populations or people who have been crushed by capitalism, as I might say, or consumerism, if my
Yeah.
anti-capitalism
Well, and I
phrase.
do. I mean, obviously my YouTube stuff is all free. I'm gonna
Yeah,
try to start building
yeah,
some teacher workshops because that's another thing. As a teacher, like, and you probably experienced this, like you have to have so many professional growth points to keep your licensing, but you're paying for that all out of pocket. Teachers already are, we don't make very much, which is
yeah,
fine, right? Because it's about the work. But at the same time, like I want to take some of that stress off their shoulders. So if
yeah,
they can have free professional development courses that focus on this content that maybe could inspire them,
yeah,
or even
yeah.
just homeschool families that are, they realize, okay, our kids aren't in public school anymore for XYZ reasons. I have no idea. I don't have a background in formal education. How do I go about making sure that my kids' needs are being met? I think that that's life-changing work.
I've been trying to figure out, I mean, maybe something we can, talk about online or offline, because I've been trying to figure out how to do exactly what you're talking about also. I mean, my career was so silly because I was a teacher educator when I had barely any experience teaching, and the experience I had was in a public school. And I'm feeling a real calling to return to offering adult training, and I just don't know. I mean, I'm also in the same bind that you're in. We want to help people who need the help the most, and we also still have to, eat.
Right. I know it's a really
Get our cars fixed.
yeah.
So, but yeah, I'd love to talk with you
Yeah,
more
definitely.
about, maybe even try collaborating on some free teacher training. And
Yeah, I would love to do that because it is like as you know, it's a lot of work to do all on your own. So when minds come together, it makes lighter work. So well, it was a pleasure talking with you today, and I think we should have more
likewise.
conversations. I think that we touched on a lot of topics that we could definitely go deeper on.
Yes, yes. I think this was a great start, and I look forward to talking with you more online and offline.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.